My name is Whitney Sorensen. I'm 38 years old, and I run a boutique wealth management firm in Minneapolis as managing partner, overseeing a client portfolio worth just over $210 million. For 3 consecutive years, my own family shut me out of Christmas dinner over a disagreement about how my grandfather should be cared for. Last December, on an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon, sandwiched between two client calls, I sat alone at my desk and opened a photo my mother had texted me. My empty chair at that same dinner table, a raised wine glass angled toward it like a small, deliberate accusation, and a caption underneath that read, "Missing the ones who chose to stay away." 40 minutes after that photo landed in my inbox, my phone rang again. It was my attorney calling to let me know she'd be attending that very family's New Year's gathering on my behalf, trust paperwork tucked under her arm, and that I should expect a very different kind of phone call from my mother sometime after midnight. If you're watching this, drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is on your end, and go ahead and subscribe, because this story has a turn in it you genuinely won't see coming. Let me walk you through how we actually got here, because none of this happened overnight. My grandfather, Harold Sorensen, spent 4 decades building a small but genuinely profitable chain of hardware stores scattered across Minnesota, the kind of stores where the owner knew half his customers by name. He sold the business in 2009, and the proceeds funded a family trust worth several $1,000,000, money he set aside, in his own handwritten instructions attached to the trust documents, for whoever actually shows up to take care of me when I can no longer take care of myself. My mother, Linda, and my uncle, Dean, were named as the trust's original co-trustees, a decision Harold made back when both of them still lived within 20 minutes of him, and the arrangement felt uncomplicated. I was the grandchild who made the 90-minute drive from Minneapolis to Harold's assisted living facility in Rochester every single week, without fail, ever since his Parkinson's diagnosis in 2019. Rain, snow, the worst stretch of a Minnesota February, it didn't matter. I'd bring him the crossword from the Sunday paper, sit with him while his hands shook too badly to hold the pen steady, and fill in the answers he called out to me. My cousins, Dean's 2 kids, showed up for Thanksgiving and Christmas and maybe a birthday if it landed on a weekend, and little else. Nobody in the family ever said that out loud as a problem. I noticed it anyway. The breaking point arrived 3 years ago, at a family meeting held in Dean's dining room, the kind of meeting where everyone already senses the outcome has been decided before anyone sits down. Dean proposed relocating Harold to a noticeably cheaper care facility, framing it, carefully, as a way to protect more of the trust value for eventual distribution. I'd already looked into that facility on my own, weeks earlier, some instinct telling me this conversation was coming, and I'd found a documented history of health code violations serious enough that I wasn't willing to sign off on the move. As a named beneficiary with input rights on the trust, I said no, clearly, calmly, and without apology. My mother looked at me across that table and said, word for word, in a tone I still hear sometimes when I'm trying to fall asleep, "You're choosing to make this difficult for everyone, Whitney, when all we're asking is that you trust the family's judgment for once." I didn't raise my voice back at her. I remember feeling strangely still, the way I sometimes feel in high-stakes client meetings when everyone else in the room is panicking and someone has to be the calm one. My cousin Brianna, Dean's daughter, tried to soften things from across the table, saying, maybe we can look at a couple more options before deciding anything. But Dean cut her off before she'd even finished the sentence, insisting the decision needed to happen that week. Something about the speed of it, the way he wanted the vote locked in before anyone could ask too many follow-up questions, told me this had never really been about cost at all. I simply told my mother, I trust facilities with clean inspection records. I don't trust convenience wearing the costume of care. Then I gathered my coat and my bag and left, and I remember the particular silence of that drive home, 90 minutes with nothing but my own thoughts and the hum of the highway, replaying the meeting over and over, wondering if I'd just drawn a line I wouldn't be able to walk back from. I hadn't yet realized how right that instinct would turn out to be. Within a month, without anyone ever formally announcing it, without a single text or phone call spelling it out, I'd stopped being invited to family gatherings altogether. Nobody used the word exclusion. Nobody needed to. It became impossible to deny by the time the second Christmas rolled around, and my name simply wasn't on the group text about who was bringing what dish. For 3 straight years, I kept doing the one thing that actually mattered. I kept showing up for Harold every single week, regardless of what the rest of the family was or wasn't doing around me. I still remember one visit in particular, maybe a year and a half into the exclusion, when Harold, on a lucid afternoon, asked me why nobody else had come by that month. I told him work had been busy for everyone, which wasn't exactly a lie, but wasn't the truth either. And he studied my face the way he used to study a set of blueprints back when he still ran the stores himself, and said, "You were always the one who actually listened, Whitney. Don't let them make you feel small for that." I didn't tell him about the Christmas photos. There didn't seem to be any reason to hand him one more thing to worry about. I also kept detailed records, an old professional habit bleeding quietly into my personal life. Every visit logged, every conversation summarized, every observation about the quality of his care written down with a date and time stamp. The same instinct I'd trained into myself for compliance purposes at the firm. And quietly, almost as an afterthought at first, I made a decision that would end up mattering more than anything else I did in those 3 years. I retained an estate attorney, a sharp, unshakable woman named Renata Kessler, whose job was simply to keep an eye on how the trust was being managed from a beneficiary's vantage point. After I'd started noticing distribution numbers that didn't quite add up under Dean's stewardship as lead trustee, Renata and I met quarterly at first, in a small conference room 2 floors below my own office, going through statement after statement together. For the first year, there wasn't much to find. A few irregularities here and there, nothing that rose to the level of real concern. "Keep watching," she told me each time. "Patterns take time to show themselves." I trusted her instinct the way I trust my own instincts with a client's portfolio. Quietly, without needing to be convinced twice. The only contact I had with my family across those 3 years was that same photograph, arriving every December like clockwork. My empty chair, that same faintly cruel caption, a small annual ritual that told me far more about their own discomfort with my absence than it ever told me about myself. I want to be honest with you about something. The first year, that photo genuinely ruined my entire night. I sat with it for hours, turning it over, wondering if I'd overreacted, if I should have just signed the paperwork and kept the peace. By the third year, something in me had shifted, almost without my choosing it to. I'd started treating the photo less like an emotional gut punch and more like a data point, one more piece of evidence in a very different kind of file I'd been quietly, patiently assembling the whole time, without even fully admitting to myself that's what I was doing. Then, this past November, Renata called with news that changed the entire shape of the story. Her review of 3 years of trust financial statements had turned up $340,000 in distributions to Dean's household, vaguely logged in the paperwork as family support disbursements, well beyond anything Dean was actually entitled to under the trust's original terms. Worse, far worse, the paper trail showed that Harold's actual care facility bills had gone unpaid for months at a stretch. At several points over those 3 years, despite there being more than enough money sitting in the trust to cover every invoice twice over. "This has stopped being a family disagreement," Renata told me over the phone, her voice carrying none of its usual courtroom calm. "This is a fiduciary breach. And as a named beneficiary, you have legal standing to step in and force an accounting." She walked me through the numbers line by line that evening, month by month, showing me exactly where the gap sat against Harold's actual invoices. And I remember sitting at my kitchen table well past midnight, staring at a spreadsheet that finally, after 3 years, explained something I'd only ever felt in my gut without being able to prove it. We filed a formal request for trust accounting with the county probate court in early December, a decision I didn't make lightly, timed deliberately to land before the family's annual New Year's gathering. An event Dean had hosted for years and always used as his personal stage for announcing the family's financial direction going forward, usually with a glass of wine in hand and everyone nodding along. I wasn't invited to that gathering. I never had been, not since the falling out 3 years earlier. But Renata, as my formally retained attorney and by that point a court-recognized party in the ongoing accounting dispute, had every legal right to serve notice of the pending action in person. And she chose, deliberately, to do exactly that, walking straight into the gathering itself, where both Dean and my mother, along with the rest of the extended family, were present. She arrived at 7:30 that evening, right as everyone had settled into after-dinner drinks and the usual comfortable noise of a family gathering winding down. She asked politely for a few minutes of the room's attention. Calmly, without any theatrics, without raising her voice once, she explained that a formal trust accounting action had been filed with the county probate court, that a hearing date had already been set, and that the $340,000 funneled to Dean's household over the previous 3 years would need to be formally accounted for or returned in full. According to everything my mother told me afterward, and she called me that same night, close to midnight, for the first time in 3 years, Dean's face did something none of them had ever seen from him before. Genuine, unguarded fear, quickly followed by a scramble to explain the money away as necessary expenses tied to managing Dad's care, his voice apparently rising with every sentence as the room grew quieter around him. Except Dad's actual bills went unpaid for months at a time, my mother said to me over the phone, her voice smaller than I remembered it ever being. I had no idea. Not until tonight. I just assumed everything was being handled properly because Dean kept telling me it was, and I never once thought to check. I didn't feel the triumph I might have expected to feel in that moment. Mostly, I just felt tired, the specific, bone-deep exhaustion that comes from being right about something for 3 straight years while everyone around you insists, gently or not so gently, that you're simply being difficult. I raised a glass to your empty chair 3 Christmases in a row, my mother said quietly, and I could hear something breaking loose in her voice as she said it. I think I need to sit with how wrong that was for a long time. I told her I appreciated her saying it, but that I wasn't ready to act like the last 3 years hadn't happened just because a court filing had finally forced an honest conversation none of us had been willing to have on our own. She took that without pushing back, without the usual defensiveness I'd come to expect, which itself felt like a small, real kind of progress. The hearing itself 6 weeks later was smaller and quieter than I'd imagined it would be after 3 years of buildup. A plain room, a probate judge who'd clearly seen this exact story 100 times before in 100 different families, and Dean's own attorney trying, and largely failing, to reframe $340,000 of undocumented withdrawals as reasonable caregiving expenses. I testified for maybe 20 minutes, walking the judge through 3 years of visit logs, dated and time-stamped, alongside the facility's own records showing exactly which months had gone unpaid. I kept my voice level the entire time, the same voice I use walking a client through a market downturn. Steady, factual, no room in it for the years of hurt underneath the numbers. Dean was formally removed as lead trustee and replaced with an independent, court-appointed fiduciary, someone with no stake in the family's history and no patience for vague accounting. He was ordered to repay $190,000 of the disputed distributions, while the remainder was ruled defensible under a broader reading of the trust care provisions. Harold has since been moved into a properly vetted facility with a clean inspection record and a staff that actually returns phone calls. Given his condition, he doesn't fully grasp the legal details of everything that happened around him. But on his good days, he understands one thing clearly enough. I never once stopped showing up, not for a single week in 3 years. My mother and I talk every week now. Cautious, still finding our footing, but real in a way our relationship hadn't been in a long time. She came with me to visit Harold 2 weeks ago, the first time in 3 years we'd sat in that room together, and she cried quietly in the car afterward, apologizing again for the photos, for the caption, for 3 Christmases of choosing comfort over asking a single honest question. I told her I didn't need the apology repeated every time we spoke. That once had been enough to hear, and that what mattered now was simply what we did going forward. Dean and I haven't spoken since the hearing, and I don't know that we will anytime soon. I've made a quiet peace with that particular silence. If I'm honest with you, some part of me expected the resolution of all this to feel more like victory than it actually did when it finally arrived. Mostly, it felt like relief. The very specific, very quiet kind of relief that only shows up after you've been carrying something heavy for so long that you've genuinely forgotten what your own shoulders felt like without the weight of it. Here's what I actually took away from all of it. sitting alone in my office, watching a photograph of my own empty chair land in my inbox right before my attorney walked into that same house carrying paperwork that mattered more than any seat at any table ever could. You don't need a chair at someone else's dinner to have a rightful place in your own story. People can toast your absence as many times as they like, year after year, glass after glass. They can't argue with a trust document that still has your name legally attached to it. If any part of this hit close to home, tell me in the comments about a family gathering you weren't invited to, and whether the truth eventually found its own way into that room regardless of who tried to keep it out. Subscribe as stories like this one stay with you after the screen goes dark. Send it to someone who's ever been quietly written out of their own family story, and I'll catch you in the next one.